this?
Sure, sure.
Yeah. Okay.
You just put
Oh,
there is
I can
the
see. Yeah. There's
share
a
sign
share option.
below
Yeah.
Stoicism. Hello, good morning in Brazil, good afternoon in UK. Ladies and gentlemen, it's my pleasure to introduce you to John Sellars, Dr. John Sellars. Dr. John Sellars is a reader in philosophy at Royal Holloway, University of London, a visiting research fellow in the Department of Philosophy, King's College London, where he is affiliated to Ancient Commentators on Aristotle Project. He was also a member of Common Room at Wolfson College, Oxford, and one of the founders of modern Stoicism. Dear John, many thanks for coming. I will now hand it over to you.
Thank you very much, Aldo, for the introduction and the invitation. So I'm going to share my screen now, as I've got some slides. If I can make it work. Okay, I don't think this is going to work. I'll just give it another quick go. Okay, that's not going to work, so I'm not going to do that. I'm just going to read.
If you want, John, you can send it to me by to my mail, and I will upload it. It's no trouble. Just send it to me to my mail, and I upload it.
Yeah, sure. Okay. Right, there we go. That should be on its way. Sorry about that, folks. But let me make a quick start anyway. So thank you all very much for tuning in. What I want to do is talk about the three topoi in Epictetus, in particular in Discourses 3:2. And in that passage in Epictetus, he says that there are three topoi, or areas of study, in which people who would like to be fine or good ought to be trained. The first of these, he says, is concerned with desires and aversions. The second is concerned with choice and refusal. And in general, with what's an appropriate way to act. And the third is concerned with avoiding errors in judgments and assents. And for those of you familiar with Epictetus, you'll be familiar with these three topoi. Now, a number of scholars have suggested that these three areas of training in Epictetus correspond to the three traditional parts of philosophy, namely logic, physics, and ethics. And it's this idea that I want to interrogate or re-examine in this talk. So the first of Epictetus's three areas, the one concerned with desires, is said to correspond to physics. The second area, concerned with choices, is said to correspond to ethics. And the third, concerned with assent, is said to correspond to logic. Now, at first glance, it seems fairly easy to make these sorts of connections. So the third area, concerned with assent, syncatathesis. This is a key term, of course, in Stoic epistemology, which is part of logic. So we can see a connection there between that topos and logic. And we're also told that the second area is concerned with is appropriate, kathekon, which of course is a technical term in Stoic ethics. So by process of elimination then, the first area or topic dealing with desires and aversions must then correspond in some way with physics. Now, this third correspondence might seem less obvious, but one could argue that the best way to manage one's desires is to know what is reasonable to expect, and that requires knowledge of how the world works, namely physics. So I saw the slides pop up there briefly, Aldo, which was great. Can we have those?
Oh, just a moment.
Okay, well, while we wait a minute for that, as I've said, what I want to do is re-examine this claim that these three topoi correspond to these three parts of Stoic philosophy. And what I want to do is begin by looking at some of the things that previous scholars have said about this connection and some of the arguments that have been made in favor of thinking that there might be a correlation between the three topoi and the three parts of philosophy. Then I'll consider an alternative interpretation that sees the three topoi not as correlated to the three parts of Stoic philosophy at all, but instead as a structured program of training in three stages. And I'll also consider whether both of these interpretations might apply at once. And then what I want to do towards the end is bring in another account of three topoi that we find in Epictetus in the Enchiridion, the handbook. So if we can move ahead to the next slide, we'll see that initial passage from the discourses. And then here, the initial passage from the discourses setting out the three topoi. And then on the next slide, although it looks like a bit of the bottom has come off a bit, you can see the correlation between the three topoi and the three parts of philosophy. So desires and aversions, physics, choices and refusal, ethics, and then assent and logic. Okay, so the first person to consider the claim that the three topoi might align with the three traditional parts of Stoic philosophy was probably Adolf Bonhoeffer. If he was not the first, his discussion has certainly been the most influential. However, although he seems to have resisted concluding that there was a clear alignment. While acknowledging a connection between the third topos and logic, he was more inclined to see both the first and the second topoi as being aligned with ethics. The first concerned with our inner character, and the second concerned with our outward actions. So if we can go to the next slide, please. So this is from Bonhoeffer. He says, Epictetus also sometimes lets the first two topoi together come into a contrast with the third. Those two concern the care of the character, morality in the narrow sense, as compared to dialectical perfection, which the third topos has to do with. The first topos only has to do with the inner state of mind and outlook on life. The second, on the other hand, comprises all practical action. So here he looks like he's drawing a contrast between ethics and logic. Even so, Bonhoeffer is often cited as a proponent of the identification of the three topoi with the three parts of philosophy. Even if he does claim it elsewhere, the passage here at least shows some indecision or doubt on his part. The earliest person that I found who explicitly affirms a clear correlation is Paul Elmer Moore in the extended chapter on Epictetus in his book Hellenistic Philosophies from 1923. And if we can move to the next slide, we'll see what he has to say. He says, in a loose way, these three fields correspond with the normal tripartite division of philosophy. The first with physics, the second with ethics, in the narrower sense of practical conduct, the third with logic. But the correspondence, except perhaps in the case of the third pair, was never drawn out explicitly by Epictetus and should not be pressed. All philosophy was virtually ethics for him. As one can see, Moore was far more insistent on this point than was far from insistent on this point. We can still see a bit of hesitation there as well. Equally tentative was Benjamin Hidgmans, who, keen to defend Epictetus against the charge that he had no interest at all in physics or logic, referred to the three topoi as the tripartition of philosophy, which we can see on the next slide. Now, referring to the three topoi as he does as the tripartition of philosophy, that might lead one to think that he had the traditional Stoic division of philosophy in mind. However, as his discussion develops, he resists going quite that far. The third topos is identified with logic without hesitation, but the first and the second he characterizes dealing with, respectively, practical ethics and theoretical ethics. Right, so Bonhoeffer earlier drew a distinction between inward-looking ethics and outward-looking ethics. Here we've got a distinction between practical ethics and theoretical ethics. The person who's really pushed for the claim that there is a correlation and defended it and indeed offered arguments for it was Pierre Hadot. Hadot not only argued that the three topoi correspond to the three parts of philosophy, he also claimed that they offered a key to the structure shaping both the Enchiridion of Epictetus and the Meditations of Marcus Aurelius. We find Hadot stating and arguing for this correlation in a number of short essays and in his book on Marcus Aurelius, The Inner Citadel. So in one of his essays, Ancient Philosophy, an Ethics or a Practice, he writes the following, which we can see on the next slide. So Epictetus and Marcus, after him, thus distinguish between three kinds of philosophical exercises, Hadot writes. There's the exercise which consists in disciplining our active impulse. This is the matter of lived ethics. Then there's the exercise which consists in controlling our feelings, judgments, and representations or impressions. This is the matter of lived logic. And finally, there's the exercise which relates to the discipline of our desires, and which consists in desiring only what depends on us, and in accepting what does not depend upon us as willed by universal nature, providence, or fate. Such consent supposes that one understands that the events which befall human beings do not depend entirely upon us, but result from the necessary enchainment of causes, which is not different from fate. So, as I indicated earlier, the connections between the second topos and ethics and the third topos and logic seem relatively easy to make. The challenge becomes in connecting the first topos to physics, and here we can begin to see Hadot making the case for that connection. In another one of his early essays, The Divisions of the Parts of Philosophy in Antiquity, he's a bit more explicit, and we'll see this on the next slide. So here Hadot writes, Epictetus distinguishes in effect three domains of ascesis exercise: the discipline of desires, of impulses, and of thoughts. In the first domain, one exercises oneself in making one's desires conformable to the will of universal nature. In the second domain, one attempts to make one's actions accord with the will of the rational nature that is common to all men, while in the third domain, one attempts to conform one's thoughts to the laws of reason. We understand thus that these three domains correspond in fact to the three parts of philosophy, the first to physics, the second to ethics, the third to logic. In all three cases, it's a matter of a spiritual exercise. Physics, as a spiritual exercise, makes us aware of our place in the cosmos. Ethics, as a spiritual exercise, aims to make our actions conform to the fundamental tendency of human nature. And finally, logic, as a spiritual exercise, makes us test at each moment our impressions so that no unreasonable judgment will be introduced into the chain of our thoughts. Now, Hadot developed his account further in various writings on Marcus Aurelius, culminating, as I said earlier, in his monograph, The Inner Citadel. The same basic argument is repeated, namely that the training or discipline of desire in the first topos involves a specific attitude towards the cosmos and nature, and as such, it corresponds to physics. Now, Hadot's account has been fairly influential. It was, for instance, endorsed by A.A. Long in his book Study of Epictetus. And although Long opened his discussion of the three topoi by saying that they involve a procedure that Epictetus may have invented, which might be taken to imply that he thinks this is something wholly new, Long goes on to endorse Hadot's account of how the three topoi relate to the three traditional parts of philosophy. Thus, the second and third topoi straightforwardly correspond to ethics and logic, while the first ultimately corresponds to physics when understood in a suitably broad way. So if we move to the next slide, we'll see what Long has to say. How do Epictetus' three fields of study relate to the classic division of Stoic philosophy in its three parts, logic, ethics, and physics? The question has been much debated, but I think Pierre Hadot has given the correct answer. Epictetus' second and third fields obviously correspond to ethics and to logic. At first glance, the first field dealing with desires and aversions looks simply like a preliminary to ethics, or at any rate quite remote from physics or the study of nature. But Stoic physics was a very broad subject, so we should probably take the first field to include such study of human and cosmic nature as he deems necessary for beginning students to master. Now, others who have also suggested there might be some kind of correlation between the three topoi and the three parts of Stoic philosophy include my former self. In previous work, I have suggested not a straightforward identification between the three parts of philosophy and the three topoi, but at least a correlation between them, three parts of theoretical discourse standing alongside three areas of practical training. And in this, I was, for the most part, following Hadot, who, as we saw a little earlier, referred to a lived ethics standing alongside ethical theory, and the same for physics and for logic. Now, not everyone has been impressed by these arguments in favor of a correlation between the three topoi and the three parts of philosophy. Jonathan Barnes, for instance, if we move to the next slide, in his 1997 monograph, Logic and the Imperial Stoa, just emphatically states the three topoi here are not the three traditional parts of philosophy. Barnes was pushing back against Hadot, although, as we've seen, to be fair to Hadot, he wasn't suggesting a straightforward identification that Jonathan Barnes' statement seems to suggest, instead simply a correlation, a slightly different claim. Robert Dobbin, if we move to the next slide, in his commentary on Book 1 of the Discourses, suggested that it's vain to look for a complete correlation and that they do not completely correspond to one another. Like others, he admits some kind of correlation between the third topos and logic, but that's as far as it goes. More recently, Brian Johnson has been equally skeptical, doubting in particular the correlation between physics and training in desires and aversions. As Johnson notes, there's a wide variety of intellectual inquiry that falls under the heading of physics for the Stoics, much of which has no obvious connection with the training of your desires. Astronomy, the study of tides, for instance, in Posidonius, all sorts of bits of natural philosophy that don't really connect to the training of desires. So there's been some dissent and some hesitancy about this correlation, but Pierre Hadot and A.A. Long, both of course very influential commentators, have defended this idea that the three topoi correlate to the three parts of Stoic philosophy. And if not universally accepted, their view has certainly been repeated often. Now, are there any other ways in which we might understand the role of the three topoi in Epictetus? He's quite explicit that these are three areas of training. Not only that, he also seems quite explicit that they ought to come in a very specific order, in which case we might understand them as three stages in a structured program of training. There are two pieces of textual evidence for the claim that they ought to be seen as part of a structured program beyond the numbered order in which they're first presented to us in the text. The first piece of evidence is that after initially listing the three topoi, Epictetus describes the first of them, the one concerning desires and aversions, as the most important and especially pressing. This is why this area must come first. The reason why it must come first is because it deals with negative emotions, which are produced when our desires are frustrated in some way or we fail to avoid something that we dislike. And such emotions, of course, make it impossible for us to listen to reason. If we cannot even listen to reason, then we're not much use at all. So the first task must be to deal with those emotions and get them out of the way. And the way we do that, Epictetus suggests, is by paying attention to our desires and aversions. So if we go to the next slide, please. Epictetus says, among these, the most important and especially pressing is that which has to do with the stronger emotions. For a strong emotion does not arise except when a desire fails to attain its object, or an aversion falls into what it would avoid. This is the field of study which introduces to us confusions, tumults, misfortunes and calamities, and sorrows, lamentations, envies, and makes us envious and jealous, passions which make it impossible for us even to listen to reason. Okay, so that's why that topos has to come first. The second piece of evidence is in Epictetus's comment on the third topos. He says that this belongs only to people who are already making progress. He describes it as a firm consistency in one's judgments, so that even in dreams or drunkenness, one doesn't assent to untested impressions. And we'll see this on the next slide, please. So he continues, he says, the third belongs only to those that are already making progress. It has to do with the element of certainty in the matters which have just been mentioned, so that even in dreams or drunkenness or a state of melancholy madness, a man may not be taken unawares by the appearance of an untested sense impression. Now, Epictetus goes on to criticize philosophers of his day who skip the first and second stages of training and go straight to this one, the third, focusing their attention on syllogisms and logical paradoxes. Only someone who is already fine and good ought to engage in these kinds of logical pursuits, he adds. This is one of a number of passages where Epictetus might be seen to disparage the study of logic. But as we can see, he is in fact putting it at the summit of intellectual activity. It might not be suitable for beginners, but it's the perfect pastime for sages. Indeed, the consistency in one's judgments that Epictetus attributes to this third stage of training is something that one would associate with a sage, not a beginner. And so for these reasons, the third topos must come last. So it looks then as if there's a very definite order to the three topoi, and they ought not to be swapped around. Now, in dramatic contrast to that, we're told that the three traditional parts of Stoic philosophy were presented and taught in a variety of orders, with little agreement about which should come first, or indeed whether they should just all be taught together at once. Diogenes Laertius reports that both Zeno and Chrysippus started their teaching with logic, the opposite of what Epictetus is proposing, then followed by physics and then by ethics. Although we also see the order logic, ethics, and then physics also reported by Plutarch and Sextus Empiricus. Panaetius and Posidonius are said to have started with physics, while others are reported to have started with ethics. In short, there's no definite order to the teaching of the three parts of Stoic philosophy, in the way that there clearly is a very specific structured order with Epictetus's three topoi. So that looks like an important difference between these two sets. Now, the two approaches that we've considered so far are not necessarily incompatible. There's no reason in principle why the three topoi could not correspond to the three parts of Stoic philosophy and at the same time form a structured program of training that has a deliberate order. If the three topoi in Epictetus's very deliberate order correspond to physics, ethics, and then logic, that might make him committed to the claim that the study of philosophy ought to commence with physics, then turn to ethics, and culminate with logic. I say might because it will depend on how close one takes the relationship between the three areas and the three parts to be. It would commit him if he held that the three topoi were the same as the three parts. But perhaps it wouldn't if he simply took them to correspond to the three parts in some way. There's no reason in principle why someone might not hold that one ought to study the three parts of philosophy in one order and then move on to engage in practical training designed to digest those ideas in a different order. After all, the two tasks are potentially quite different in kind. Let us for a moment assume a close relationship and assume that Epictetus would have taught the three parts of philosophy in a way that mapped on to his three topoi. That would commit Epictetus to teaching the three parts in the order of physics, then ethics, then logic. And we might ask whether any other ancient Stoic taught the three parts of philosophy in that particular order. According to Diogenes Laertius, as we've seen, the only Stoics who commenced the study with physics were Panaetius and Posidonius. Diogenes does not report what they taught second and then third. But this is quite striking because it's often claimed that Epictetus paid almost no attention to these two supposedly middle Stoics. And I say middle Stoics in inverted commas because it's obviously an increasingly contested term. Instead, Epictetus aligned himself squarely with the early Stoa. Yet, as we also saw, Diogenes reports that Zeno and Chrysippus taught the three parts in the order logic, physics, and ethics, beginning with logic rather than ending with it, as Epictetus's three topoi might imply. In short, if we did assume a close relationship, the outcome would not neatly fit with other claims often made about Epictetus, namely his strong affiliation with the early Stoa. Okay, so that's one potential problem with assuming a close correlation between the three topoi and the three parts of philosophy, albeit a relatively minor one. There are a couple of other more substantive reasons, I think, to doubt the correlation. The first reason concerns the first topos. This, Epictetus tells us, as we've seen, is the most important and most pressing because it deals with emotions. Emotions are often, he says, the product of thwarted desires. Now, it might seem odd to think that the treatment of emotions ought to fall under the domain of physics. One might be more inclined to think of this as an ethical concern, or, given the central role that judgments and assents play in the production of emotions, that it ought to fall under the heading of logic. Indeed, one might think that overcoming negative emotions will require some knowledge of how judgments work, what is and is not really good, and what it would be reasonable to expect in any given situation. In other words, overcoming emotions would require for a Stoic some knowledge of doctrines in logic, ethics, and physics. It's not obvious that it neatly corresponds or correlates to any single part of Stoic philosophy. A second reason is that the distinction between the first and the second topoi might be taken to be not a division between physics and ethics, but instead a division within ethics. A distinction between inward-looking ethical self-transformation and outward-looking social ethics. Thus, Xenakis described the first two topoi as being concerned with individual ethics and socio-political ethics. And in this, he was broadly following Bonhoeffer, who, as we saw earlier, suggested a distinction between inward and outward-looking ethical development. And more recently, Long has characterized them as being concerned with inner and outer, oneself and other persons, even though, as we've seen, a few pages later in the same book, he goes on to endorse Hadot's view that they correspond to physics and ethics. This line of interpretation would posit two topoi concerned with ethics, followed by one concerned with logic. Now, to complicate matters further, there is another passage worth taking into account. And this is chapter 52 of the Enchiridion, the handbook, where Epictetus again outlines three topoi in philosophy. The first and most necessary, he says, is concerned with the application of principles. For example, don't lie. The second deals with proofs of those principles, why one ought not to lie, while the third confirms those proofs. At first glance, this might look as if the first and second of these topoi both relate to ethics, concerned with practical ethics and ethical theory respectively. And this might look like a distinction within ethics, slightly different to the one considered above, between inward and outward facing ethics. So if we move on to the next slide, let's have a quick look at what Epictetus has to say. I'll go through this fairly slowly because I'm going to be referring back to it, so we want it clearly in our minds. He says, the first and most necessary division in philosophy, and it's worth underlining that, it's division in philosophy, is that which has to do with the application of principles. For example, do not lie. The second deals with the demonstrations, as for example, how it comes to be that we ought not to lie. And then the third confirms and discriminates between these processes, as for example, How does it come that this is a proof? Is a proof? What is a logical consequence? What a contradiction? What truth? What falsehood? And if we move on to the next slide, where the passage continues, he says, therefore, the third division is necessary because of the second, and the second because of the first, while the most necessary of all, and the one in which we ought to rest, is the first. But we do the opposite, for we spend our time in the third division, and all our zeal is devoted to it, while we utterly neglect the first. Wherefore we lie, indeed, but are ready with the arguments which prove that one ought not to lie. So, as we can see, Epictetus is also stressing an ordered connection between these three topoi. The third is necessary because of the second, and the second is necessary because of the first, but the first is most necessary of all. Echoing what we saw in the discourses, he insists that it would be a mistake to jump directly to the third, which also looks like it's concerned with logic. And it would in particular be a mistake to jump to the third if we've not already mastered the first of them, concerned with how to act in this case. Now, whether this list of three topoi in the handbook is the same as the list in the discourses will inevitably have some bearing on the question of the relationship with the three traditional parts of Stoic philosophy. There seems to be some structural similarity between the two accounts of three topoi. In both passages, the first topos is concerned with ethical self-transformation, we might say. The second is perhaps concerned with ethics in some sense, while the third is clearly concerned with the analysis of logical arguments and should only be entered into last. And those similarities might suggest that this is simply a restatement of the same three topoi that we saw in the discourses at the beginning. Any minor differences between the two accounts might simply be Arrian's responsibility, because as Gerard Botha notes in the Gerard Botha notes that the opening words of this passage in Enchiridion 52 are very similar to a line in the discourses 1:4:12, which comes just after an account of the three topoi concerned with desire and aversion, choice and refusal, and giving, withholding of assent. So he thinks maybe Arrian's got that set of topoi in mind, but may have garbled them a little bit. However, I think if we look more closely, it becomes harder to argue for a close correlation between these two sets of topoi that we find in Epictetus. So if we could have the next slide, please. Okay, so the first topos in the discourses is desires and aversions, whereas in the handbook, the Enchiridion, it's the application of principles. The second is choices and refusals, but in the Enchiridion, the handbook, it's demonstrations. And the third, assents versus confirming and discriminating between these. And I'll come back to these in just a second. In the discourses, it does not seem unreasonable to claim, and many have, that both the first and the second topoi are concerned in some way with ethics. Okay, if we give up on the correlation between the three parts of philosophy, we might say the first and the second are concerned with ethics. Now, it seems much harder to make that claim in the three topoi in the Enchiridion. Setting aside the ethical example of lying that Epictetus uses, which might otherwise distract us, the second topos in the Enchiridion is concerned with demonstration, proof. Indeed, both the second and the third topos seem to be in some way concerned with logic, in the Enchiridion. In the case of the third topos, Epictetus elaborates on what he means by saying the third confirms and discriminates between these. But what does these refer to? Translators of the Enchiridion have tended to over-translate this passage in two different ways. Some have assumed that it refers to the first and second topoi, rendering it these processes, the first two, the other two, and so on. So the third topos distinguishes between the first topos and the second topos, i.e. distinguishes between the application of principles and demonstrations. Other translators have taken it to refer to the proofs covered in the second topos and have translated it as the proofs. So on the first reading, the third topos would be concerned with distinguishing between actions and philosophical arguments, we might say. Given, however, that the actions and philosophical arguments are self-evidently quite different in kind, that would be an odd thing to do. On the second reading, the third topos would be concerned with distinguishing between good and bad demonstrations, assessed according to the principles of logic. And this is how Simplicius reads it in his commentary, writing that the third topos in the Enchiridion is focused on the fact that this is a proof and that we are not being deceived. Indeed, what Epictetus says immediately next, by way of example, seems to confirm what Simplicius says. Because Epictetus writes, how does it come that this is a proof? What is a proof? What is a logical consequence? What a contradiction? What truth and falsehood? So in one sense, this third topos is clearly concerned with logic. But this isn't simply paying attention to what one assents to, as we saw in the third topos in the discourses. This, in the Enchiridion, is a much higher order, meta-level reflection on the very nature of logical concepts. What is truth? What is a proof? Indeed, it's perhaps the last thing one might expect Epictetus to insist is necessary in his supposedly practical ethical handbook. This is not practical advice he's offering, or even the arguments that underpin such practical advice. Instead, it's an assessment of whether those arguments are worthy of being accepted. And as Epictetus presents it, it is not just assessing the validity of a particular argument, but reflecting on what it means for any argument to be valid. Now, his point, of course, is that his beginning students ought to prioritize mastering good ethical conduct before they move on to this sort of higher order reflection. But at the same time, he's of course insisting that that kind of high order reflection is ultimately required if one is going to complete one's education. Now, as before, we might ask the question whether this set of 3 topoi in the handbook, the Enchiridion, might correspond in some way to the 3 parts of philosophy. If they did, in a manner analogous to the claims made for the 3 topoi in the discourses, that would require the first topos in the Enchiridion to correspond in some way with physics. Yet, as we can see, the first topos is concerned with the application of principles, and the example that Epictetus has given us is don't lie. It's not immediately clear how that could be made to correspond exclusively to doctrines in Stoic physics. One might try to do so by saying that physics is concerned with understanding the world correctly, so not lying will be an important part of giving an accurate account of the way things are. But that seems weak at best. It might just as easily be connected to ethics or logic, insofar as it presupposes that lying is something one ought not to do, or that it involves assenting to an untruth. But those are perhaps equally weak. Lying is simply the example that Epictetus, or indeed perhaps Arrian, happens to choose. And the real distinction at work here is between training oneself not to lie in the first topos and giving proofs for why not to do so in the second. Epictetus could have made this point using a variety of other examples of ethical behavior. There's no obvious topos in Enchiridion 52 that could correspond with physics. There's a further reason to doubt that the two sets of three topoi correspond to each other. The first set in the discourses appears to be devoted to practical training in three areas. The goal in each case is a transformation of one's conduct. But in this second set, in the Enchiridion, explicitly, only the first topos is concerned with conduct. The next two are concerned with arguments that justify conduct, followed by confirmation of the reliability of those arguments, culminating in the sort of understanding one would expect from a sage. In this sense, the first set in the discourses seem aimed at beginning students, while the second set seem more appropriate for someone going into an advanced philosophical education. Indeed, Epictetus describes the three topoi in the discourses as areas in which one should be trained. But he presents the three topoi in the Enchiridion as the three areas of philosophy, which might be taken to imply that he conceived them as two quite different sets doing different things. Okay, let me start to wrap up now and see what conclusions we can draw from all of this. The main conclusion that I'd like to draw is that there are some good reasons to doubt the claim that's been popularized by Pierre Hadot and A.A. Long that the three topoi in the discourses correspond to the three parts of philosophy. Epictetus makes clear that his three topoi, indeed his two distinct sets of three topoi, both have a clearly defined hierarchical, structured order. And that's quite different from the accounts that we've got of the three parts of Stoic philosophy, which are said to be closely interrelated, with no one part having priority over another, and sometimes all being taught together because there's no unambiguously obvious starting point. The second conclusion I'd like to draw is this. It's not uncommon to see the three topoi in the discourses hailed as a key feature of Epictetus's philosophy, one of the defining things that he contributes to Stoic thought, particularly in a lot of the popular literature that's out at the moment, aimed at a kind of wide public audience. You'll find whole books introducing Stoicism to a wide audience, structured around the three topoi, as this is a central idea in Epictetus. And as I mentioned earlier, Pierre Hadot argued that they offer a key to explaining both the structure of the handbook as a piece of work and Marcus Aurelius's meditations. But what about Enchiridion 52? As we've seen, that seems to offer a quite different set of three topoi. Why prioritize the account in the discourses? Let us assume that the version in the Enchiridion summarizes a fuller discussion in one of the lost books of the discourses. If that's so, then it's simply due to the contingencies of textual transmission that one set of topoi appears in the surviving discourses and one does not. If we had all 8 books, if there were originally 8 books, we might perhaps have both of these accounts in the discourses. Although commentators have tended to focus on the 3 topoi in the discourses, it is in fact those in the Enchiridion that Epictetus explicitly calls the 3 areas of philosophy. And yet, as we've seen, these don't neatly correspond to the 3 parts of Stoic philosophy either. With these 2 different sets of topoi in Epictetus's work, perhaps the 3 topoi in the discourses were not as central in Epictetus's mind as they're often presented in many modern accounts of his philosophy. And I'll stop there. Thank you all very much.
Many thanks, John. It's a very instructive presentation. I have a lot of questions, and I told you I wrote with Kelly Rudolph a paper on this in 2010, but he published in Portuguese. And I will send you the link to Kelly's presentation on Tuesday, I think, where he presents our interpretation of this chapter 52. But it's close to yours. We do agree that it is not the same 3 topoi we see in this discourse. It's a totally different thing. But let me see, Joelson, who is a PhD student of mine, he asks if Epictetus understands emotions as judgments, like Chrysippus. If so, wouldn't the 2 topos be more important?
So, I mean, well, yes, I mean, I certainly think he does think that emotions are the product of judgments, as with Epictetus. So, I mean, obviously Epictetus thinks the sort of training that he outlines in the 3 topoi is important, right? So, you know, we see him exhorting his readers, his students throughout the discourses that they ought to be doing this training, they ought to be attending to their judgments. That's his constant refrain. So that's obviously really important. But whether the particular description that he gives in discourses 3.2 of how we go about it in those 3 topoi, whether that account there is particularly central to him, I suppose that's what I'm challenging. The content of, yes, we ought to attend to our judgments, that's obviously central no matter what. Oh, you're muted, I think.
Sorry. Do you think that the first topic implies also the study of logic, since it applies to the evaluation of our judgments about things in general through the Aversions distinction, correcting by this way our desires?
Yes, I mean, it's interesting. I mean, if you think about logic for the Stoics, I mean, it's such a broad category, right? It covers so much. So attending to your judgments will attending to your judgments is going to fall within logic understood broadly. You know, epistemology is obviously essential, right? You need to correctly understand the world around you. So in that sense, you could argue that some aspects of logic are fundamental and foundational. They underpin everything, right? But then at the other end, there's the arguing about logical paradoxes and thinking about the structure of syllogisms. And obviously he thinks that that's for advanced students. You don't start doing that. So there's a sense in which logic comes in right at the beginning, attend to your judgments, but it also comes right at the end. Don't worry about the liar paradox until you've done all these other things first. So, yeah, I mean, so it's interesting. And again, perhaps that is also a good reason for avoiding trying to attach logic to one of these different stages in Epictetus' training schedule. It's like, well, if we say logic connects to the first topos or the third topos, we're ruling out the possibility that in fact logic has to come at the beginning and at the end. So yeah, that's a really interesting point.
Yeah, that's my point of view. I think he reserves advanced studies of logic to the third topic, but the students start studying logic since the beginning, because as you said, logic in the Stoic sense it implies a lot of things: rhetorical studies and the theory of fantasia, of representation, theory of language, and dialectic.
Yeah,
and the study of sophisms and so on. It's a very large subject. David Fiedler. Hi, David. He has a question, a very good presentation. John, I was skeptical of the claim that Epictetus' philosophy was rigorously divided into three topoi, and that modern people in Stoicism should approach Stoicism with a threefold division.
Yeah, I mean, just to, to step back from the academic side of things, I think when people today have become very interested in Stoicism as a body of practical advice that they might want to try and live their lives according to, I think at the beginning what everyone was doing was looking at these texts and saying, well, what can I take from this? How can I turn this into some kind of structured program? How can I give myself some organized advice or recommend advice to other people? And I think the three topoi was something that people latched on because it just looked like it was Epictetus calls it a training program in effect. So people kind of latched on it because it looked like, okay, we can use that, we can do something with it. And so it's attracted quite a lot of attention for that reason, I think. But perhaps more attention than it really deserves. Maybe, the division in Enchiridion 52 could be as useful. Maybe we ought to give that a bit more weight, or at least as much weight. I'm really just trying to sort of complicate things.
Aldo, there is a question from Inara.
Yeah, yes. Inara Zanuzzi. The second topos in the Enchiridion regarding demonstration could not be understood as dealing with physics insofar as physics is necessary to the proper demonstrations.
Yeah, I mean, I can see what you're trying to get at there, but to be honest, I think it's kind of clutching at straws a little bit, as with some of the other attempts that have been made. So, I mean, in his example, for instance, Epictetus says, the first topos in the Enchiridion is don't lie, and the second one is the arguments why you ought not to lie, right? Now, the arguments why you ought not to lie are going to be ethical arguments, right, rather than arguments in physics. Now, I imagine we could pick a different example and run it through, and it could be much more concerned with physics, and the demonstration would involve some knowledge of physics. But in the example he gives, it looks like it's going to be dealing with it could superficially look like it's concerned with an ethical argument. I think the mistake would be to try to pin it down to either physics or ethics. It's concerned with demonstrations, with giving justifications. So if you want to try and pin it to one of the three parts, that sounds like it's the domain of logic. But as I've tried to argue, I think it would be a mistake to try and tie it down to that threefold division of Stoic philosophy.
Yeah, you can say that the Topoi a pedagogical tool for Epictetus, right? Not exactly a division of philosophy. John, can you say that Barnes in Logic in the Imperial Stoa is right when he says that Epictetus criticized the Stoics of his time for not giving attention the due attention to ethics, but only to logic? If it's so, can we say that the popular picture about Stoicism in the imperial period as way of life is a simplification that does not correspond to reality?
Yes, I mean, that's a very good question. I mean, I suppose it depends who Epictetus was criticizing. I mean, my general sense is that he's criticizing his own students. He's criticizing his students of his in his classroom who get fascinated in all of those logical puzzles and want to show off how clever they are. The graduate student in the seminar who wants to show how they've I've mastered these really complex things, and we all enjoy trying to master these puzzles. So I think his comments are directed towards those students, and he's saying, hold on, people, you're jumping ahead. You first need to sort out your basic judgments and emotions and ethical behavior, and then we can think about these interesting logical puzzles. Don't neglect the more important things. Now, I take it that in Jonathan Barnes's comment implies that Epictetus's comment is not directed at his students, but is directed to lots of other Stoic philosophy professors, to put it anachronistically, out there somewhere. I mean, yeah, I've not really read the passage in that way. And I suppose we could ask, okay, who would these guys be? Where would they be based? What other Stoic schools were there around 100 AD that we know about? I'm not sure what evidence we have for that.
There's another commentary of Dave. You can see that approach in a handbook for new Stoics by Massimo Gregory Lopes, where all 52 lessons are divided into 3 parts under the 3 disciplines of desire, action, and assent. I don't know if it's a question. I think it's a commentary, right?
Yeah. No, David's absolutely right. Massimo and Greg have taken up that idea and used it to present those ideas. But in their defense, they're not attempting to give an accurate account of Epictetus. They're saying, look, this is a useful structure that we can use to give people this modern advice. So for their purposes, and they're quite open about this, it works quite well for what they're doing. But it might unintentionally give us a slightly, put more stress on this in Epictetus than is really there.
Mm-hmm. Well, sorry, I didn't present Marcos Rezende, who is my PhD student. But now there is the question. If you would present Epictetus' philosophy, would you do it through the 3 topoi?
Would I? No, I don't know. I don't. Yeah, it's a good question. It's a good question. I think I would want to. I think I would want to use both sets of topoi in the discourses and the Enchiridion, because I think they're both useful. I wouldn't necessarily want to just focus on the one in the discourses and neglect the one in the Enchiridion, because I think the one in Enchiridion is quite interesting and enlightening too. So I think I'd want to present both, but I'd certainly avoid any connection with the 3 parts of Stoic philosophy.
John, I have a question that is kind of linked with this last question. What are the implications of studying Epictetus with the focus only on ethics?
Yeah, I mean, that is a good question, and I think it would be a mistake. And again, I mean, there's something really interesting, I think, standing behind much of what I've been talking about, which is, what's the motivation? Why would someone want to push this connection between the 3 topoi and the 3 parts of philosophy? in particular Pierre Hadot, who really is the person who put this on the map. But we also see it in some of the other mid-20th century commentators. And I think the motivation is that they want to present Epictetus as a philosopher who isn't just doing practical ethics and who is interested in all three parts of Stoic philosophy. And so this is their way in which they can try to say, look, he's interested in physics and logic as well. And even though I'm skeptical of that correlation, I do think that Epictetus is interested in all three parts of Stoic philosophy. We've talked a bit about logic already, the insistence on the role of judgments, right? That's clearly central. And we've talked a bit about him criticizing his students for focusing too much on logical problems and puzzles. Well, there's only one way in which his students would become really obsessed with logical puzzles and problems, and that's because he's been teaching them to them in his class, right? You know, and again, he also warns his students, don't get too lost in the exegesis of Chrysippus. Well, the reason why he's warning them not to get too lost in it is presumably because they spend a lot of time in the classroom doing precisely that. And the other thing that people often notice or comment on in Epictetus is the way in which he regularly makes reference to an individual, almost personalist God, and he talks a lot about providence. And so the idea that some study of physics, theology, cosmology, you know, all interconnected in a very broad sense is part of the picture that he's showing us. That seems key as well. So it's certainly not just ethics, I would say.
Many people still believe that Epictetus is an orthodox Stoic, as Bonhoeffer argued a century ago. Do you agree with him? Or can we see some Posidonius in Epictetus, Posidonius and Panesius in Epictetus also?
I mean, I think he is orthodox. I mean, I think one of the points that Bonhoeffer and others made is that there's simply no mention of Panaetius or Posidonius. We don't even hear a mention of their names, let alone any suggestion that their texts are circulating. And the other thing that I think is quite striking about Epictetus is there's a lot about Socrates, of course, as a role model. And he's obviously reading the early Platonic dialogues as a source of information about Socrates. And then we've got all of the material about Diogenes and cynicism, right? And if you go right back to the beginning of the Stoa, you go right back to Zeno, you know, Socrates and Diogenes are going to be two of the big formative influences on early Stoic ethics. You know, for Zeno certainly, and for say Aristo, who, if you like, is, you know, following in the tradition of the Cynics in some ways in his ethics. And I think Epictetus is very much within that tradition, right? What you might call the kind of the hardline, no compromise Stoic ethics, right? Whereas, you know, Panaetius, you know, famously says, well, you know, let's not worry about the sage. Let's worry about what the person in the street is going to do. Let's try and make this something more relatable and more practical, something that can appeal to the kind of the Roman audience of his day. And so you've got Panaetius and following him Cicero offering a fairly mild version of Stoic ethics that might be attractive to the average person in the street. And then you've got Epictetus harking back to Diogenes and to Socrates and the kind of, you know, this is the aspirational high ideal that we should all be working towards, even if we might not all get there.
Okay, there is another comment of Dave. Didn't Hadot also try to link the cardinal virtues with the three topoi and the three branches too, like in this diagram?
That's certainly possible. But yeah, I don't recall that off the top of my head.
It's a question of Diogo da Luz, who is a PhD student. In Brazil, there is a broader vision of Stoicism with an emphasis on the social, natural, and spiritual aspects. Virtue does not seem possible without this perspective. What do you think about it?
Yes, certainly. I think the social aspect is very important. I mean, there's a sense in which that's what the virtues are for, right? I mean, particularly if we think about, say, the virtue of justice, but also courage and moderation, which will shape our interactions with other people. So the social aspect seems absolutely essential, right? There's a, famously in Marcus Aurelius, he talks about retreating into his inner citadel. And sometimes people have taken this to be a kind of anti-social aspect of his thought. But of course, what he's suggesting is you retreat into your inner citadel to gather yourself together, to do that work on yourself so that you can improve yourself ethically, precisely so that you can then go back out into the world and interact with people and be a better, more virtuous ethical agent. You don't just develop the virtues and then sit there on your own and don't do anything, right? That would be crazy. So that outward looking social side is absolutely core, I think.
John, from your presentation, can we say that it doesn't matter the order, but if we don't have all three topoi, the Stoicism will not exist, right?
Depends which set of topoi, right? So, I mean, I take it that for both sets, if someone wants to become a really accomplished practitioner of Stoicism, then all of them are going to be essential, right? So yeah, I think, yeah, I mean, in terms of the three topoi in the discourses in particular, where we're thinking about ascents and desires and choices, all of those are things that we're going to have to attend to if we want to become accomplished Stoic ethical agents. That's for sure, right? In the set in the Enchiridion, you've only got to master the first one and you're acting correctly and you're fine. Yeah, whether you've got all the arguments to hand to justify that behavior, let alone the arguments about what counts as a proper argument, that stuff you don't need in order to be a good Stoic ethical agent, right? You are going to need all of that if you want to be a sage, because if you're a sage, you're going to have to really have all the knowledge in order to be able to justify and explain absolutely everything you're doing. But that's a more ambitious goal than simply, I want to try and practice Stoic ethics in my daily life. So in fact, I think that's another way in which you can see a big distinction between those two different sets of topoi. There's a sense in which all three topoi in the discourses you could compress almost into the first topos of the Enchiridion, because they're all concerned with action.
Well, I think we don't have more questions. John, many thanks for coming. Many thanks for your excellent presentation, and
no, thank you very much for the invitation and for all of your questions. And just as a final comment, I'll say that this paper is going to come out with an online open access journal at some point next year. So it'll be it should be accessible to everybody if they're interested.
And there is a draft of it on academia.edu, right?
Yeah,
there may be. I lose track of what I post there. But
there is one more question here from.
I think you put. I think you published. No.
Yes.
From David. I don't think there is any evidence I suspect they probably were. It was an order developed by Epictetus. That's my gut feeling.
Okay.
Okay. So many thanks. And do you have a message for the Brazilians who study Stoicism? We have a lot of Stoics here, both scholars and followers.
No, it's fantastic to see such a flourishing community, and I know you've done a lot of great work, Aldo, and so I'm very pleased that it's been going well there, and I hope that it continues to flourish.
Many thanks, John. Thanks, Marcus, and see you in the afternoon for more two conference. Bye bye.